Hello students, welcome to today's class. Today we are going to discuss various aspects of the Neolithic revolution. In the earlier lectures we have looked at the diffusion of agriculture which emerged in the West Asian parts of the world and which later dispersed to other parts of the planet. This is the second lecture of the series and today we will be talking about the diffusion of agriculture from these West Asian territories to other parts of the world. There are certain objectives of today's class, and after going through this lecture, you will be able to know various aspects of the origin and growth of the agrarian communities, about the spread of various agricultural communities in different parts of the world, basic crops and grains that were grown in these areas which we are going to discuss today. And lastly, the characteristic features of various farming communities in different regions of the world. In the last lecture on the evolution of farming in West Asia, we talked about some prime areas from where the earliest paleobotanical evidences contest the early farming practices. The development of agriculture in these areas further disseminated to others. And in today's lecture, therefore, we will be focusing on some other regions in the regions of Mesopotamia, Europe, America and Asia, and we will evaluate the evidences from these regions about the development of agriculture. First, we will be talking about the Zagros Mountains and the Mesopotamia region. Although there were sporadic contacts between the Zagros foothills and Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast, cultural developments in this region ran parallel to and independently of those in Abu Huraira, Muirbet, Jericho and other western locations. We know more about the highlands where agricultural circumstances were less favorable according to Robert Bradwood's groundbreaking research than we do know about early food production in the lowlands, the undulating northern Mesopotamian steppe where the Assyrian civilization flourished millennia later. Throughout the Holocene geological era, the sandy Mesopotamian plain acquired thick layers of silt. There are possibly several feet of alluvium buried beneath an early farming settlement. Under massive city mounds like those of Ur and Eridu, there are still some tiny farming settlements that date to no earlier than 5800 BCE. Human populations most likely resided in the warmer lowlands during the late Ice Age. Because the lowlands, a natural home for wild greens and pulses, were warmer and drier than the highlands in the very early Holocene, agriculture most likely started there initially. People migrated into the wide steppe land of Zagros, where seasonal supplies were distributed vertically up hill slopes as the climate warmed. Herding may have originated here earlier than in other Southwest Asian regions due to the appropriate terrain for it, as it was an adaptation to a region with scarce and dispersed resources. Now we will be talking about a settlement which is known as Zawi Shemi Shanidar. Wild goats were a common prey item for hunters and gatherers who were utilizing the resources of the foothills around 10,500 BCE. In the Kurdistan mountains at this time, a small settlement known as Zawi Shemi Shanidar's inhabitants were engaged in hunting and gathering while living in small circular huts. The residents appear to have fenced up their grazing areas for effective intensive hunting because they were killing a lot of young sheep. Zawi Shemi might have been a summer camp located on the steppe. Studies of pollen reveal a rise in cereal grasses during the occupation, possibly indicating intermittent farming. Now, another important settlement is Ganj Dare, which was initially habitated around 10,000 BCE, and it's located high in a nearby mountain valley. A later habitation, beginning approximately 8000 BCE, included a small hamlet of rectangular mud brick homes, some of which were 2 stories high. The first settlement was likely a seasonal camp used by hunter-gatherers, and clay containers have been discovered there, suggesting that the lower stories may have been used as storage. The Zagros region's first permanent settlement, Ganjdare, was centered on farming and the herding of goats and even cattle. The mortality profile of managed herds, as shown in the goat bones, is characterized by a high percentage of subadult males and a preponderance of older females. Now coming to another settlement, which is known as Jarmo. This was a permanent hill town located in southeast of the Zavishemi Shanidar site that was inhabited around 7000 BCE and is one of the most well-known farming communities in the Zagros Mountains. Jarmo was hardly more than a collection of 25 mud brick dwellings which were arranged in an ad hoc huddle and divided by narrow lanes and courtyards. The constructions at this place consisted of storage bins and clay ovens, both of which were essential components at the settlement. Numerous agricultural remnants were discovered in the Jarmo deposits with the bones of sheep and goats, including the seeds of barley, emmer wheat and other small crops. Even though hunting had lost some of its significance, as seen by the few wild animal bones that remain, the toolkit still contained Stone Age style tools with skill blades, grinding stones and other tillage tools. Exotic resources including obsidian, seashells and turquoise are found in Jarmo and were imported into the Zagros region. There were also a lot of clay tokens which may be more proof of a long distance trade related recording system. Compared to its predecessors, Jarmo was a completely developed permanent community that engaged in much more intense agriculture. More than 80% of the food consumed by the locals came from cattle or crops. Another important settlement was Ali Kosh. Agriculture was established in the lowlands along the eastern margin of the flat Mesopotamian plain at the same time as along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Ali Kosh site in Kyrgyzstan's Deh-Loran plain, north of the point where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the sea, records human habitation beginning around 7500 BCE. Ali Kosh was initially a tiny settlement of rectangular, multi-roomed mud brick homes. The residences became bigger over time and were set off from one another by alleys or courtyards. The locals drew sheep and goats to highland pastures in the mountains during the sweltering summer months. Even now, this transhumance pattern, which means the seasonal migration of herding populations to new pastures, this remains prevalent in the region. Lentils, emmer, ain corn, barley and other crops have been grown since Ali Kosh's earliest days. Hunting and gathering were essential, as were fishing in a nearby marsh and collecting the waterfowls. This well-excavated site records the development of farming and herding in the lowlands, including the introduction of superior grain strains and irrigation as a means of enhancing agricultural output. When Ali Kosh was founded in the lowlands around 7500 BCE, agriculture and herding were already well established there. In the very early Holocene, hunter-gatherer communities likely first developed animal husbandry and cereal farming along the shore. Now we will be talking about another region, which is Europe. The extensive glacial and interglacial eras during the Pleistocene and other climatic changes have continuously led to changes in how people obtained sustenance. The methods of hunting and gathering had never been continuous, and changes did not take place consistently across the globe. In the late Pleistocene, for example, advanced hunter-gatherers in northern Europe had grown totally reliant on reindeer hunting. Reindeer were replaced by other herbivorous mammals in northwest Europe with the advent of post-glacial warm weather and the gradual shrinkage of the ice sheets. These animals included red deer and elk. Some areas of Europe had moderate climate by 12,000 BCE. Ice sheets in the far north began to shrink, exposing land in Scandinavia that offered new land parcels. The Mesolithic sites of Hungary, Germany, and France have shown that groups of hunter-gatherers had already made use of the newly formed lakes and streams. Fishing and hunting were being used as additional means of subsistence in other places, such as the region surrounding the Baltic and the Caspian Seas. The archaeological evidence from the Mesolithic period, which stretches from 13,000 to 11,000 BP in northwest Europe, demonstrates how the climate changes led to an abundance of small, fleet-footed animals like deer, water birds, fish, snails, and mussels. Therefore, the Mesolithic communities had turned to a more active food gathering. Only areas with a lot of natural resources might use this method of getting food. However, these techniques had to be replaced by more extractive ways of obtaining food as the number of sources decreased. The first documentation of domesticated cattle, pigs, and emmer wheat in Europe dates to Greece around the year 9000 BP. In the fertile food plains of the Balkans, where people domesticated sheep and goats and produced wheat and barley, early farming attempts were highly thus successful. The environmental and temperature ranges in the Balkans are comparable to those in West Asia and even Anatolia. As a result, some academics or scholars have placed a strong focus on the cultural ties that the Balkans had with Anatolia, which was just across the border. However, the fact that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had previously lived in these regions demonstrates the localized nature of early farming in this region. They might have had communication with their counterparts in West Asia. Around 7,000 years ago, a complicated network of population movements from the Balkans and hunter-gatherer adaptation allowed them establish themselves in the fertile loess soil region of temperate or Central Europe. Barley, wheat, and other minor crops like flax may all be grown well in this region. Crop rotation was a strategy used by early farmers. It was common practice to cultivate some plots while leaving others fallow, for the soil to regain its fertility, which repetitive farming had stripped it of. The stubble of the crop was burned after it was harvested. This method is known as the slash and burn farming or Sweden cultivation. This allowed the farmers to stay in one location for a longer period of time. The northwestern Mediterranean regions started producing food much later than the Balkans and temperate Europe. We first find signs of land clearing, domestication of sheep and grain plants, and some sort of trade among Mediterranean coastal tribes in the 9th millennium BCE. Ironically, some of the last of the great game animals, including the elephant and hippo, were wiped out at this time on the islands of the region because hunting continued to be practiced. Hunter-gatherers were able to prosper in Eastern Europe due to biological diversity and diverse flora and fauna. A pine and birch forest with a mix of broad-leaved species in the north and steppe vegetation in the south, which supported huge animals, blanketed Eastern Europe around 10,000 BP. These might offer a large foundation for the hunting-gathering economy. Some researchers go so far as to claim that there was a subsequent immigration of excess Neolithic populations to these ecological niches where they embraced the Mesolithic way of life. So it was not feasible to reverse the process of acquiring means of subsistence. The exploration of the origins of agriculture thus far seeks to demonstrate that the early farmers did not adapt to particular environments, but rather to the plants and animals present in many locations. It must have been via the gathering of the seeds of these plants that knowledge of the growing of certain green plants first emerged. According to the movement and or availability of plants and animals in various locations during specific periods of the year, the Natufians have planned their hunting and gathering activities. They eventually became dependent on specific plants and animals as a result of scheduled or time-bound methods of obtaining food as opposed to unpredictable and unplanned food procurement strategies. The reference to several locations in West Asia and Europe to support this claim shows that year-round habitation in the same area were possible even in the absence of fully developed agriculture. However, the opposite may also be accurate. Even after certain crops were domesticated, nomadism can still exist. This occurred in unfavorable environments like Mesoamerica, which is the region between the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. It was challenging for the hunter-gatherers to find game in this area. After 11,000 BP, the climate in the Tehuacan Valley region, which is located 125 miles to the southeast of Mexico City, became more arid and dry. The hunter-gatherers turned to season-specific hunting and gathering, which prevented resource exhaustion. People relied on hunting to survive in the winter, while in the summer they foraged for fruits and seeds in the valley's better watered areas. Now let us move into details about the food production in this American land. The Native Americans were notable for their knowledge of local plants. They domesticated numerous species of crops that are now widespread throughout the world in addition to the staples like maize and beans. Only a handful of species, including the guinea pigs, llama and turkey, were accessible in the New World to be domesticated in contrast to the countless options in the Old World. At the end of the Ice Age, potential beasts of burden had vanished. Similar to the Old World, native plant experiments got underway early, particularly in the Andean region of South America, where humans continuously worked to expand the range of wild plants into disadvantaged environments. As early as 2500 BCE, hunter-gatherer societies in the major mid-western river valleys in North America began cultivating natural plants like gosefoot and marsh elder to augment wild stands. Additionally, the Guayana-Necus excavations in central Mexico demonstrate that hunter-gatherers in Central America experimented with bean and squash cultivation as early as 7000 BCE in order to survive dry years in an unpredictably changing environment. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World in 1492, maize was the main grain crop for many Native American communities. From sea level to high in the Andes, in low-lying marsh habitats and in the arid areas, it was grown from Argentina and Chile northwards to Canada. Over thousands of years, hundreds of domesticated maize races developed, each with a unique adaptation to the environment. Teosinte, which is a wild grass that grows throughout much of Central America, is regarded to be the wild ancestor of maize. Tosante underwent human selection to become a simple maize that was much simpler to harvest. The Tehuacan Valley in southern Mexico and the Valley of Mexico itself in the highlands are where the earliest maize crops are thought to have originated. The Tehuacan Valley's inhabitants were cultivating amaranth, gourds and maize by 1700 BCE to the extent that it dominated their sustenance economy. Tehuacan is by no means exceptional because at this time several ethnic groups in Central America were pursuing agriculture. After 2700 BCE, a rudimentary variety of cultivated maize with kernels arranged in 8 rows became the ancestral crop, which eventually migrated thousands of miles from its original location. By 2500 BCE, inhabitants in the Andean highlands of Peru were growing crops including potatoes, maize, beans and even squash. Some of these crops like quinoa, potatoes and beans were even grown much earlier. At least 2500 BCE saw the domestication of llamas, and by 800 BCE, maize farming had likely moved from Central America to the highlands and subsequently to the dry Peruvian coast, where it was farmed under extensive irrigation projects in the river basins. The coastal civilizations that arose around the Pacific after 800 BCE relied heavily on this intense agriculture. And by around 1500 BCE, maize farming had moved into the southwest region of North America, where chilly winters and dry circumstances made grain farming challenging. However, the sedentary Pueblo Indian communities that emerged in the southwest after 2000 years ago were based on maize and bean agriculture. The ancestors of contemporary southwest Indian culture were the well-known Anasazi, Hohokam and Mogollon cultures of the southwest. Some Anasazi pueblos hosted hundreds of people between the 10th and the 13th centuries CE, particularly in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico and Mesa Verde, Colorado, especially during significant seasonal rituals. Pueblo societies in the southwest were prosperous and extremely adaptable to erratic semi-arid surroundings. As a result, they were never able to reach the level of societal complexity seen in North America further east. In the eastern woodlands of North America, hunter-gatherer groups were regularly cultivating native plants by 2500 BCE. During the first millennium CE, maize crossed the southern plains into eastern North America, but it wasn't until after 800 CE that it really took off. By this time, many eastern societies were ruled by strong kin leaders and lived in sizable sedentary villages. Now moving to the Southeast Asia, let us see how agriculture developed in this region. Although the data is very debatable, there are indications that wild plant meals were used extensively in Southeast Asia's highlands and that wild yams and other root plants may have even been domesticated as early as 8000 BCE. Domestication of rices and Asian millets, ancestors to modern rice, began somewhere between Northeast India, Southeast Asia and southern China. Most likely, the first stages of domestication took place in an alluvial marsh where there was regular seasonal flooding to promote crop development. The middle Yangtze River Valley in China has the earliest records of rice cultivation, reaching as far back as 7000 BCE. However, further research is anticipated to uncover the early dates for the Ganges Plain and the other areas as well in the present India. Southeast Asians were relocating to lowland areas and river plains by 6500 BCE, where rice farming was possible due to intense cultivation and irrigation practices. Although the introduction of rice is not well known, it quickly became the essential food source for farmers throughout southern and even Southeast Asia. Between 5000 and 4000 BCE, a group of rice growers lived in a swampy location at Homuto in coastal southern China. They lived in a community of exquisitely crafted wooden cottages that were surrounded by forests and was convenient to a wide variety of food sources. A particular style of pottery with cord decorations was produced by the ladies of Homuto and was popular in Southeast Asia, Taiwan and even in Japan. Instead of rice, North Chinese farmers relied on regional cereals and seeded plants like millets, sorghum and mulberry grown on the soils from river valleys. Agriculture was another regional development. The earliest farming communities existed as early as 5000 BCE. The Yellow River Basin, which is comparable in size to the earliest agricultural hubs in Egypt or Mesopotamia, was the focus of the Yangshao farming culture for the following 2000 years. Each Yangshao settlement was independent and looked out over a productive river valley. By 3000 BCE, the Yangshao people were embracing a distinctive and wholly Chinese culture that had its own naturalistic aesthetic. Chinese language and food may have their origins in this Yangshao culture. Over the course of 2000 years, China saw the development of numerous unique farming cultures. They developed into the Langshunoid cultures, which were the founding civilizations of early China. So with this, we have come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you so much.